If you own a cat, then you are no doubt familiar with the concept of a villain. A morally bankrupt individual pursuing zero-sum objectives without any regard for the pain and suffering they inflict on those in their path. I mean, he meows the entire Star Wars theme song every morning, but refuses to do it on camera. Come on. Every great story needs a great villain. A hero can only be measured against the foes they come up against. But crafting a villain is no simple task, and there are a raft of mistakes that can damage your story worse than a mad scientist with a space laser pointed at the White House. Today, we're talking about 3 mistakes that will ruin your villain. You know what isn't a mistake? Subscribing to my channel, because you'll get more content like this. Alright, mistake number 1, having a villain with the wrong amount of power. Being in a leadership position is much more tenuous than most people realize, and if the group you lead leans towards the villainous side of things, then things are even more tenuous. Whether you're the leader of a country, the leader of a fringe political party, or a cult, or a criminal syndicate, staying in that position of power requires maintaining the loyalty of everyone beneath you. Well, maybe not everyone, but at least a large enough group of underlings to intimidate the rest of the underlings. Any loss of favor within this group, any chink in a villain's power is going to become problematic very quickly. While this issue exists to a certain extent for heroes or the leaders of good groups of people, it's amplified 10 times for any sort of villainous organization. These places don't tend to attract the most savory individuals, so the moral compass of most members tends to have a giant magnet attached to it. This makes coups or leadership fights or just general chaos and lack of loyalty quite common in these sorts of groups, whereas the groups that heroes tend to lead tend to be more loyal and motivated by a sense of morality, which tends to make people less likely to turn on a hero than on a villain. Any villain that shows any sign of weakness is going to have their position threatened, and this fact is going to affect every single one of their actions. Every action your villain takes needs to be in service of keeping their underlings in line and on favorable terms. Even if these actions go against a villain's main aims or even directly undermine their objectives, they still need to keep their constituencies happy, or at least terrified of them enough not to resist. These dynamics have important story ramifications as well. If you have a villain that is so powerful, so unstoppable that no amount of resistance from their underlings or anybody else could usurp them, then anything that the heroes do to defeat that villain is going to seem unbelievable. Having the villain exist within a realistic leadership structure where they have a realistically tenuous hold on that leadership is going to make the defeat of that villain much more believable. Good villains need to be supported by a realistic power structure. Failing to have that is a major mistake that will cause problems with your villain. Next up, mistake number 2, a lack of clear motivation. It's very easy to just take whatever motivation your hero has and have the villain be motivated by the opposite thing. Your hero wants a non-nuclear missiled world in order to raise a family in, so your villain naturally wants to fire the damn missiles. Doing this becomes problematic quite quickly because it will remove a lot of depth from your villain. They will seem like an imposing force created solely to antagonize the protagonist. You need to remember that very few villains will self-identify as villains. To them, they are doing the right thing. Their actions are justified, and they have very well-defined reasons for doing what they do. They think what they're doing is the best way to do things. They might not love the idea of fascism, but figure it's the only way to get the economy moving. They might not like being corrupt, but figure if they don't take the money, then somebody else will. They might not have been born wanting to create mayhem and bloodshed, but after a lifetime of horrible experiences, that's the only thing that they know. I don't think that a lot of villains are born villains. They become villains through time, and that experience gives them very specific reasons why they chose to be a villain. If you aren't giving proper page time to why your villains are villains, then you risk creating a flat, uninteresting villain. So what are some ways to counteract this? Creating a backstory for your villain that at least explains some of the reasons why they act the way they do is a really good start. Also, try to frame the villain's actions from the villain's point of view. Why does what they do make sense to them? How could they see themselves as good? Why are they driven to do these sorts of things? What makes them feel that this is a good thing to do? This can take a lot of time and effort, and you will probably have to devote some time within your story to expositing these sorts of details, but they will go a long way to making your villain much more three-dimensional and way more interesting. If you don't flesh out the motivations and you don't inform the reader why your villain is a villain in the first place, that's a big mistake that's hard to recover from. Lastly, mistake number 3, making the villain too evil. Wait, isn't that the whole point of a villain? Aren't they supposed to be evil? I've talked before about how oftentimes in writing, it's not about just cranking up an element to the max. Just doing more of something is rarely a recipe for success. It's about doing the right amount of something, not just more, and this applies to your villain as well. An over-the-top villain becomes tiresome and cliched quite quickly. I mean, he murders his underlings, he poisoned an orphanage, he only tips 5%, he doesn't wipe down his weights after using them. Come on. At a certain point, the reader will pick up on the fact that you're just adding in evilness for the sake of making the villain more evil. Really good villains often have morals, or at least codes or certain lines that they refuse to cross. They might even be considered upstanding citizens by other characters in the story. That's another type of villain. Having a moral code or some standards around your villain and what actions they're willing to take has the effect of making the villain seem more intelligent. It will also flesh out the character a little bit more. It'll allow the reader to sort of empathize with the villain on a certain level. Also, dialing back the puppy murdering can have some other advantages. There's a lot of mileage that you can get out of the reader having some level of sympathy for the villain, and this is much easier to do if the villain has some kind of honor code or a certain line that they won't cross or some set of beliefs that tempers their actions. Maybe not even sympathy. Sympathy might be too strong a word, but the reader should at least have a sort of tacit acknowledgement that the villain makes a few good points. This ties back into the whole motivation thing that we talked about earlier. While the reader may not approve of the villain's actions, they should at least understand why the villain behaves the way that they do. Another thing that this applies to is if your villain isn't just super evil, there's a possibility for some sort of a redemption arc. Personally, I think stories are always more interesting when there is the potential for a villain to redeem themselves, or when you have a villain that's having strong doubts about what they're doing. There's a lot of different avenues you can take here. You can have the villain do the full 180 to redeem themselves. They can get right up to the edge of redemption before snapping back to villainy, or they can make the decision to redeem themselves way too late, and then they only have the option to sacrifice themselves. But if you make the villain too cartoonishly murdery, you destroy any possibility for any of that. So think about adding just a few dashes of evilness rather than dumping in the whole evilness jar. Just like the whole jar of this video was dumped into your face/ears. There you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can subscribe to my channel. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.